Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual book discussion with Dan Legier this evening. We're really excited to have you. And I know we're going to have a great conversation over the course of the next hour and a little bit. Um, Welcome. I'm Cynthia Ryan. I'm the now past chair of IPAC Nova Scotia. I'm sure in the fall you'll get to meet our current chair and other new board members on our website that we just elected this past June. So keep an eye out for that. And we've got a couple of great guests to have a chat with you this evening. So first we've got Lori Turnbull. So Lori is our moderator for the discussion, and she is a lovely member of our board as well. Lori is a professor in the Faculty of Management at Dalhousie University here in Halifax, and she's an expert in Canadian parliamentary governance, political ethics, and electoral systems, just to name a few areas that Lori likes to dabble in. We've also got Dan Legier here with us. Welcome, Dan. Dan is one of Canada's most versatile journalists. After 12 years reporting for the Canadian Press in Halifax, St. John's, and on Parliament Hill, he moved to the CBC as a producer and executive producer. In 2005, he joined the Halifax Chronicle Herald as managing editor and columnist. He is a Gemini Award winner and holds 2 Atlantic Journalism Awards for commentary. Dan regularly appears on TV and radio, so I'm sure he is a familiar face to many of you joining us this evening. And Dan is here to chat with Lori for a little bit about his recent book release called Stephen McNeil, Principle and Politics. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lori.
Thank you. Thanks, Cynthia. And thank you, Dan, for being with us and for agreeing to share your wisdom and your book with us and some of your thoughts on Stephen McNeil. This is really a treat for us. And thank you, everybody, for coming today. So I'm going to try to pack as much into the next 55 minutes as possible. And so I'm going to try to make my questions really pointed so that we can hear as much from Dan as possible and as little from me. But I am going to set the stage a little bit here, because I want to start. Stephen McNeil is such an interesting figure politically, and I'm fascinated by why you chose to write a book about him. But I'm going to throw that out there as a sort of blanket question for the whole time, anytime something comes to mind. But I want to start back before he was premier, because when he became leader of the party in 2007, this was not an easy time for the Liberal Party in Nova Scotia. Like, this was, they had last formed government 1998, 1999 with Russell McClellan, and then John Hamm and the Progressive Conservatives came in for a while. At this point, the NDP were rising as a very strong second place party, which they had never been before. They formed the official opposition, which they had never done before. And all of a sudden, even though Nova Scotia has a small population, I wouldn't say a particularly far-ranging ideological spectrum, we became a robust three-party system, which was a really kind of fascinating turn of events, and one that I think was particularly difficult for the Liberal Party, because in the 2006 election, before McNeil became leader, the party had 9 seats and was in 3rd place, which was a lousy day. So I'm just wondering if you could bring us, if we can go back to that time a little bit, and if you can help us understand exactly what were the circumstances when he became leader of the party. I will just let you go.
Well, first off, Lori, and to Cynthia and all your members, thank you very much for having me on tonight, give me the opportunity to talk about my book and the process, I guess, of investigating Stephen McNeil's political career and the impact that he's had on Nova Scotia and Nova Scotians. Yes, when Stephen McNeil, I think it is fair to say, never really saw himself necessarily as leader of the party or premier of Nova Scotia, although I will contend with anybody after my 40 years of covering politics that just about every person who gets elected dog catcher sits there at night just before they turn off the light and thinks, gosh, maybe I could be prime minister someday. And politicians, I admire and I'm fascinated with them because they share these wonderful ambitions and this boundless self-confidence to the point of obnoxious self-confidence in many cases, but that propels them into the public forum and makes them seek out positions of power. I don't think people give enough thought to what actually motivates politicians, and there's so much superficial analysis on that. I mean, that's a question for another day. But your summary of the conditions of the Liberal Party at the time of Stephen McNeil's first sort of entry into the ranks of the potential leaderships is absolutely right. You know, they had gone through a crisis of leadership. Francis Mackenzie had ended up as a very unpopular compromise leader. He was deeply unfit for high public office or political leadership. Danny Graham had taken over, who was a popular leader, not a particularly dynamic figure, but a telegenic guy, very user friendly. People liked him. He was a good communicator, and I think I know him a little bit from other pursuits as well, and a very kind of public spirited guy who wanted to do well. But as I'm sure people will recall, his wife became ill, gravely ill, and over the next year or so, her health deteriorated, and she passed away, still a young woman. And Danny Graham was left with 3 young boys and felt he couldn't carry on in politics given the family situation. And, you know, the party was really casting about, looking for someone to lead them out of the swamp and towards back towards a role. The NDP, as you alluded to, were coming on strong, you know, under Darrell Dexter, and the Tories were looking like a pretty sad sack show. You know, after Ham, who I think was an effective leader on some levels, but you know, the party deteriorated under Rodney MacDonald, whose leadership was absolutely feckless, and they just made one misstep after another, opening the door to the Dexter regime. And I hope people who read my book can savor some of the bits on the downfall of the Dexter regime. And I rely heavily on Graham Steele's observations. And I mean, all hail Graham Steele. I think he's made a great contribution to the political dialogue in this province, and I admire him very much. And he told me the story, he and others in the NDP, of how they were coming apart at the seams. And Stephen McNeil, you know, an overarching theme of my book is that he's always been kind of lucky. You got to be good to be lucky. You got to be lucky to be good. And I think that has benefited him. And those were the conditions that were there when McNeil contested the leadership and set himself on the path to the premiership.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I found your comments about what motivates politicians. I don't think that's a conversation for another day. I think that's absolutely a conversation for today. I'd love to come back to that point about what sorts of factors propelled Stephen McNeil to come into politics, because he is in many ways a very unusual politician in the context of what we see in politics today. And I mean that with and I mean that in a positive way. He is not a soundbite guy. He is not you know, I'm going to package myself in such ways that I'm trying to appeal to this kind of constituency. It's almost like some of the things we talk about in terms of politicians really chasing votes and chasing vote margins and becoming obsessed with it. And, you know, we can see some politicians right now on the federal level, before our eyes, changing their brand, changing their physical appearance in ways to try to appeal to slivers of the population because they want to put together a winning coalition. And Stephen McNeil, in many ways, seems to be the opposite of that. He's like, I'm going to do this, and here's why. Not much on here's why, just a little bit. And you're with me or you're not. It never seemed to me that he was afraid to have people disagree with him or to say he was wrong, to say he made this decision in a bad way. He didn't consult whatever. He seemed never to shy away from those things. And so it seems to me like in the context of today, whether you're looking at Poilievre, Trudeau, whoever, like he is very much authentic as opposed to like responding to the brand politics we see now.
Right. And yeah, I love talking about these sorts of things. One of the reasons why I got into the book, and it really wasn't my idea originally. It was Terry Bulger's idea over at Nimbus. I had done a book about Mike Duffy and his fall from grace a few years before. And Tara Lee liked that book, and she was kind enough to suggest me looking at McNeil, uh, which I did. And I think your analysis is bang on. I mean, he was a guy who didn't really come from the normal ranks. He understands the game of modern politics better than almost anybody I've met in the business over the years. He had a kind of Jean Chrétien way of understanding what regular people were talking about and how they were feeling. He was not a good communicator when he started. His own very close, intimate aides told me that some felt he could never get elected as a leader or as premier because of he tends to mumble, he raises ahead with his thoughts. He uses language. He's not a sophisticated communicator, put it that way. But he has a very subtle mind, and he's an incredibly quick study. He's a master of briefing book and things like that. My spouse had worked for John Crosby for a while when he was federal minister of fisheries, and she worked in the policy analysis and briefing side of the minister's office, and she said it was astonishing what that man could absorb in an overnight, and there aren't enough, data wonks out there in politics nowadays, I think. But McNeil was certainly one of those guys who could memorize, if not memorize, but he could absorb complicated issues readily and put them in ways, interpret them in ways that voters and electors and the people that work for him could understand. So that is a gift. That is a political gift that is not endowed on everybody. He was able to capitalize on that over time. But he is a different character, and I do think he's a product of his environment. His family background is really interesting. I mean, one of 17 kids. His mother was an embattled single mom and a great inspiration to him and his family. And a true leader that you don't often encounter nowadays. And he was influenced by all of that, the very Annapolis Valley kind of values, sort of socially progressive, didn't want to leave people behind, but also he was very strong belief in fiscal rectitude, not to be outspending the taxpayers' money where it wasn't necessary to be spent. So those are the types of influences on him, I think, that characterized his career and made him kind of a different character than your cookie cutter politician that you were alluding to.
Yeah, I absolutely, that's fascinating. And I'm so curious about everything that you've learned about Stephen McNeil, the person, because I think he's a hard person to get to know in a lot of ways. He doesn't put it all out there. And again, in today's politics, you see sometimes more of that, trying to build that personal brand. And you see, even whether it's a true brand or not, like you see someone like Doug Ford, for example, going on doing these videos where he's cooking in his kitchen. It's all like, get to know me. And he wants people to like him. Doug Ford wants people to like him. I don't think Stephen McNeil cares. Not that he wants people to dislike him, but there's something that there's a distinction between those two. Maybe they are really strong examples of very different things, where McNeil seemed to have been able to keep going as premier even when he didn't have everybody around him. So I wanted to focus on that too, just kind of taking us back a little bit earlier. When he became the leader in 2007, and the election came in 2009, he didn't win, obviously. It didn't go, that wasn't great. It wasn't the end of the world, but it wasn't great. And in 2010, after that, he, of course, faced a leadership review. But there was a lot of speculation, it seemed at the time, about how much McNeil really had the caucus behind him. And I can remember going to the Liberal AGM that year as an observer, and the sharks were out, right? Like Michelle Sampson had a hospitality suite. Diana Whalen, who had come a close second to McNeil in 2007. There was this sense that there was still kind of something unsettled about the caucus coming around him. Can you talk to us a bit about how he managed that? How did he manage his relationship with his caucus over time? What did he do when some supporters got defeated or didn't run again? Like, how did he actually put this together once he was leader?
Well, what he did actually says a lot about his views on the world and on how to manage politics. You're absolutely right. I mean, there was a sort of simmering stream of not quite revolt, but also discontent and unhappiness. Diana Whalen never really accepted that she got beat by McNeil. She took it very hard, and her people. See, this is what often happens in politics. We tend to ascribe everything to the leadership. You know, Danielle Smith is not the only stupid person in Alberta. She's being supported by many other stupid, wrong-headed people, I think. You know, Doug Ford is not the person animating everything going on in the Ontario government by far. So it takes a lot of like-minded people to get anything done. Over time, McNeil developed an intense loyalty amongst the people who were intimate with him and who knew him well. People like, you know, Lori Graham, who worked very closely with him. You know, they all felt a deep personal connection because, you know, for all McNeil's sort of, I don't want to say taciturn, that's more of a Stephen Harper thing, but McNeil's kind of, he's big, he's a bit intimidating, he's got a deep voice, he comes on a little strong, and you know, it does put some people off, but he has another side to him. He remembers people's birthdays. You know, he calls them up and sings happy birthday on the phone. He remembers that people's kids were in the hospital or that their uncle died and things like this. Is retail politics, you know, the way it should be practiced. I knew Jean Chrétien quite well. I covered him. I was actually a neighbor of his in Ottawa when he was out of politics, and we used to walk once in a while and have these unbelievable opportunities to speak to Chrétien for 20 minutes or 25 minutes when we walked downtown together, just meet by accident walking along the canal. And I could ask him any crazy question and he would tell you just about anything that he wanted. And, you know, McNeil admired Chrétien profoundly and used to call him and get advice and things like that from him. So McNeil has a way of engendering this type of loyalty among his people. And that was true right through to the end of his time in office. But politics is politics. You have grasping and ambitious people like Michelle Sampson and Diana Whalen. That's what makes political parties successful, is you need these types of people who are reaching for the top, so to speak. But they are always, that's part of the fun of covering politics, is that they're always a little bit dangerous too. So anyway, there was this sort of simmering revolt. McNeil tackled it head on. He caused the vote to be held and basically faced down the mutineers to where they realized that there was no percentage. You know, they couldn't draw their sword against the king and risk not being able to put it back. So after he put that down, that was the end of internal dissent within the Nova Scotia Liberals. McNeil was the undisputed leader. And, you know, as time would prove, you know, I make a few comparisons between McNeil and Angus L. MacDonald. Not that I think McNeil is the type of towering statesman and hero that Angus L. was, but he came from a offbeat kind of rural part of the province. He wasn't from the moneyed classes. He was not a downtown Halifax lawyer's son or anything like that. He inherited the reins of the party when it was deeply unpopular and had lost a number of elections and was almost in a state of chaos, and built it back from the grassroots until it brought it back to power. And I know the Liberal Party in Canada and in Nova Scotia, and the one thing they care about is being in charge. And when he brought that for him, that for them, that made everything a lot easier.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There's a lot to unpack there. So just taking us forward chronologically a little bit, 2013, he wins the election, clear majority in the fall of 2013. An uncharitable view of this would be the Dexter government defeated itself. There was no way in hell they were coming back. The Tories hadn't gotten it right, hadn't figured it out, hadn't chosen the right person. Stephen McNeil comes up the middle because he's the only one left. Is that the case? Or did he win the election? Did he gain people's trust? Did he run a good campaign? Did he campaign on issues that resonated with people? Did people want to hear about fiscal accountability and responsibility? Did people trust him with healthcare? Did people trust him to work with the unions?
Right. It was all of the above. And I don't think very often you'll see any election that is won because of one issue or one theme. He even had help like with Justin Trudeau, who had just become leader of the Liberal Party of Canada and came down. And remember, he was a rock star at the time. I mean, times have changed, obviously, over 10 years. But Justin Trudeau came twice, as I recall, during that campaign and was a big help to McNeil. But you're right. The Dexter government had, when they got elected, I thought, well, this is really something different and could really last. I mean, Dexter had some very talented people in his cabinet. They had a fortress of voter support in Metro Halifax, Dartmouth. They were new, they were different. People seemed willing to get off their old liberal or conservative kind of preferences and try something different. And you're right, they killed themselves from inside. There was a group, led by from Halifax, the MLA from Halifax had been a city councilor, tell me. Anyway, it'll come to me in a minute at old age. Anyway, they had a group of dissidents, and they weren't actually radicals. They were the traditional NDP. They were part of the traditional NDP way of seeing things, that there should be much more power, in unions, and that you had to have free government spending in order to keep the wheels going. They were all very, social justice was a major element of their interest. Economic justice was very important. And so there was this group of dissidents within the NDP that plotted and schemed and worked against Dexter. And then Dexter was sort of being pulled by Graham Steele and some others within the party who were more fiscally conservative and saw that the Nova Scotia voter was not really looking for a radical Marxist alternative. They wanted somebody who kind of looked like the parties that ran the province in the past, but didn't have so much toxic baggage of the kind of Rodney McNeil or the Liberals in the previous few years. So they were willing to take a tumble on Dexter, but they just kept making unforced errors. I mean, like the Blue Nose is always my favorite, which just became a giant fiasco because of just bad public management. But they had many other instances like that. They got buffeted by the economic situation, of course, at the time, the recession, 2008, 2009, that time period. Dexter came into office with a lot of bad economic indicators to deal with. There was a crisis in the forest industry, which undermined their support among Liberal MLAs. Recall the NDP had won a whole beachhead down along the South Shore. They won 3 or 4 seats down there and had done well in places like Pictou County, which are traditionally very conservative places. So they had made the breakthrough, the Orange Crush. I was working at the Chronicle Herald. That was a wonderful headline, which was everyone in the whole newsroom knew that was going to be the headline that night after the results came in. But, Dexter was exposed. They didn't know how to respond. Dexter himself, I think, had some leadership issues in that he failed to rein in the dissident group and just seemed, and of course, the other thing was the MLA expense scandal, which happened in 2010. And while I don't know if you can hear my dog expressing her security concerns outside, but she is. And but anyway, the 2010 expense scandal, which Dexter came off as completely tone deaf, and it was a very hot issue in the public, and he just did not seem to understand that it was an issue that was so easy for the public to understand. These elected people had misused money for their own benefit. They stole from us. And you can go on and on about industrial policy, the environment, the economy, but this was an issue that people understood. And as the political leader of Nova Scotia, Dexter failed to take that matter in hand. And I don't think they ever shook it off.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I agree, and I remember that. It was. You're right. Like it's one of those things that people can absolutely grab onto, and be they don't get it, and it's that type of thing to happen on the NDP's watch when people, I think, voted for them because they weren't like the other guys in a lot of ways, and then to have this happen then was so off brand and hard for them to recover from, I think. Okay, so sorry.
Well, no, I would only have said that that McNeil, by contrast, because members of his caucus were also caught up in the MLA expense scandal, and he cracked the whip and said, "Okay, we're not going to defend people who've gone wrong, and we're going to pay back." And he went on out in public, and he made a public apology and promised to do better. And this is the thing I think people forget in our time and our age of toxic politics, is a promise to do better is still a powerful message. And that was the message that McNeil left at the end of the MLA expense scandal.
Yep. Okay, so he becomes premier, 2013. He's got, little does he know, he's got until March of 2020 to actually sort of be in control of things. He doesn't know that he's going to be a COVID premier. He doesn't know that he's going to be a premier during the biggest mass shooting in Canadian history. He doesn't know any of that. So there's a period of time between 2013 and 2020 where he has an agenda. He wins a majority, again, a smaller one, but he makes it. In terms of the issues, what will Nova Scotians, like, what are the key ones? I absolutely agree with you about the impact that McNeil has had on the province. And you can look at his thoughts on healthcare are particularly, I'm struck by the granularity of detail he can go into when he talks about healthcare in the province, and why people want these things, but actually what we really need are those things, and how hard it is to be able to communicate that message. And he obviously, his approach to education reform went over like a lead balloon in a lot of ways. The way he dealt with unions, the essential work legislation that's ended the nurses' strike. These were all, the end of the film tax credit, like the sorts of things that really stuck out in people's mind as, what the heck are you doing, actually? Mm-hmm. What can you talk to us a bit about his time before COVID? Like, what was his legacy before that? If he had quit in 2019, what would Premier McNeil's legacy have been?
Yeah, at the risk of going counterfactual, and to say there had been no COVID, how would it have been different? And I would like to spend a bit of time, maybe at some point, to talk about 2020 and the terrible year, because it was devastating for him personally and for all of us who lived here. Where I'm sitting right now is just a few kilometers from Portapique, and our whole community here went through that terrible nightmare, and so did McNeil. But your question is about the previous time to that. Yes, he came with an agenda. He believed that the cost of government was increasing faster than the incremental increase in revenue without massive tax increases. I didn't mention, and I should have, that Dexter had grabbed a couple of tax points from the HST that the feds had abandoned, and in effect imposed a tax increase. And that was a very damaging decision by the Dexter government. It was it was the right thing to do. Fiscally, it was the right thing to do, but politically, not so much. McNeil didn't want to raise taxes. He was okay on raising, user fees and sin taxes and all those sorts of things. Your smokes and your booze and all that got more expensive under McNeil. But he he also felt that the public service had gained the upper hand in negotiations with the province. And he got out some blunt instruments to deal with it. And my book goes extensively into that, partly because of the very generous interviews by Bernie Miller and a few others who were intimate to this process. And in some ways, bringing in Bernie Miller right at the start was a key factor. Miller had come over from a big law firm in downtown Halifax, McGinnis Cooper, and had been the managing director of the firm. So he was kind of the CEO or the COO of the law firm. And I'm sure a lot of your members know how law firms work. Somebody has to tend to the business and make sure all the bills get paid and, even more important, collected. And this is what Miller had been doing for 7 years. And he told me he wasn't that keen on going back to his practice, which his own personal book of business had deteriorated over his time running the company. And he wasn't really keen on going back and building a new client base and starting back again. And an opening came up for the cabinet secretary's role, in other words, deputy minister to the executive council, I guess. And he was encouraged to look into it and to apply for it. So he applied, as I'm sure all your members are aware. He applied and was, ratified through the public service, regular public service sort of procedure. He wasn't a liberal. He was not politically active. He only knew McNeil from a beer that he had with McNeil at McNeil's apartment in downtown Halifax, around the time when McNeil was looking and thinking about possible applicants for the job. But Miller had a way and the skill set that enabled McNeil's ideas to be put into practice. So, as I mentioned, McNeil is a very quick study and very able to absorb complicated data and understand complex issues. And Miller, I think, helped put structure on it. So McNeil had set out a list of priorities: fiscal, education. It was speed anyway. It was fiscal, education, E and D, I forget, and I shall have to go back and read my book to remember that. But there was this sort of mnemonic that they had within the McNeil cabinet and government, senior public service, that they're going to tackle the fiscal first. That was number one under McNeil, and he wanted the gap between the increase in revenues and the increase in expenses expected from the government to be narrowed and actually brought down to zero. And this was what he told Miller and others: we want to see some zeros. And so they were going to go at the public service, which is, your members, I think, probably different from any other audience that I speak to about politics, understands a lot of the boundaries that exist around political leaders. So much of every tax dollar is spent on entitlements and built-in sort of non-optional expenses. So the actual running of government, the discretionary, if you will, funds are much restricted, and they're not as easy to add to or to subtract from. So McNeil identified cost of the public service as the main element of where that would have to go. So he basically wanted zeros. He wanted some zeros in the public contracts, the new labor agreements that were coming into play, and actually, especially since the Dexter government had given quite generous wage increases to the public service and really didn't get anything in return. So what McNeil said, well, we can't really pay more, and we are expecting more in terms of protection of the public interest from the public service. So he had a very complicated agenda, and the first whole term of his time in office was spent trying to achieve that. And as you alluded to, he met very stout opposition from some very capable people. So it was quite a fight.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it seemed like that was, in some ways, I think when he was taking on different sectors of the public service workforce, sometimes it seemed like there was this assumption that people would support the workers, and there was so much criticism of him. But it seems to me now that a lot of people may have quietly, not necessarily been out in the street, with their "Yay, Stephen McNeil" signs, but a lot of people were happy with the way he dealt with things and were on his side, even though they didn't necessarily vocally say it.
I think that's absolutely.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Lori. And they had polling, which backed that up. I mean, the Nova Scotia the economy here is very heavily tilted toward the public service because we have so many defense and the healthcare system is concentrated in Halifax, and Nova Scotia does provide services in healthcare to other provinces in the region. So, we have a very high percentage of the population employed in the public service. However, it is less than, it's around 30%, I think, or 31%, or it was when McNeil came into office. So around 69% of the participants in the labor force were in the private sector, where, whether it was accurate or not, they had the perception that they worked more hours for less pay and fewer benefits. Whether that is, it's not true in every case, obviously, because lots of people in the private sector make good money and have good benefits. But overall, there was this feeling, and I do think you're right that McNeil et al. Capitalized on that and realized that when it came push to shove, that people would end up saying, well, gee, I don't think these unions have got it so bad. They got guaranteed jobs, they got vacations, all the good dental and pension benefits, and that not every worker in the economy gets. So I do believe you're right that they capitalized on that, and I don't think it was done by accident. I think they saw that as an opportunity.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so before we switch to COVID and the last few years of his time in office, because I think that's a very, very important chunk that we could spend a lot of time on. But just before we get there, what about his relationships with cabinet, with the legislature? Nova Scotia made history for how little we sat during the time that Stephen McNeil was premier. What was that about?
Yeah, you'll recall when we were talking, when I was working on the book, Lori, and this was a key thing that you identified, and McNeil did engender intense loyalty among those who agreed with him and those he nurtured as his supporters and backers. But if you were on the other side of politics, he could be aggressive to the point of rudeness, and he could be overbearing. And in the minds of some people, had an authoritarian streak, which did come out. He did not want to be accountable particularly. He did not want to be accountable to the media, for instance, who he very accurately saw as a element in society that was getting weaker by the day and by the month, and not stronger. So he didn't have a lot to fear from the media. He realized that he had the whip hand when it came to negotiating with the unions, because after all, as he set out to do and did, they passed extensive legislation which restricted the sort of options of the unions and cut back their power. He did other there were several anti-union or not pro-union pieces of legislation. Remember the first contract arbitration scramble and all that. So he was not going to be labor friendly, but I think he, as we alluded to, he probably knew that the public would give him some support in that area. And he was not afraid particularly of the backlash. The backlash was strong. It did cause him problems, and it did undermine his position politically. But I had many occasions where the people told me where he told his caucus straight out, some of you guys are going to go down because of what we're doing tonight, but them's politics and it's going to happen. So that was bold, and I admired that about McNeil.
Yeah. At a certain point, you've got to respect the straight talk, and the acknowledgement that he's making decisions and he understands they have costs, and he's not BSing anybody about the fact that they could be the ones that pay the cost, not him.
That's right. Yeah, and I mean, he had cabinet ministers who got defeated, who told him this is going bad. You've got to do something, but no, he wasn't going to, and he had a plan, an agenda. I think he knew himself he wasn't going to be premier for 20 years. Longevity in politics is not exactly a guarantee of long-term success in terms of public policy. I mean, John Buchanan was premier for, 11 or 12 years and got nothing done at all. And it was astonishing. And so, it's as a measure of what he got done. Now, not everything stood up, as we saw with the teachers union, the court case that overturned much of his labor reforms when it came to the NSTU. And there was no love lost between the teachers. We all have friends who are teachers. I admire them, and I think they're terribly underappreciated. But they hate the man and despised him, and they probably had some cause. But it was he did not want to sit on his hands and just watch the world go by and just plot and scheme over the next election. He had an agenda, and it was due. It all came back to these Valley and family principles that I think he really adhered to and based all his actions on.
Yeah. And I was struck by what you said about him knowing that he wouldn't be premier forever. Because I think a lot of politicians now that thought doesn't cross their mind. And if it does, not really, right? Like they kind of know that in an abstract sense, but they don't know it in a okay, I'm going to have a finite number of years. And so I want to get these things done before I run out of time. And I know that's a different proposition if you're a premier than it is if you're an MP or an MLA. If you keep getting elected and you keep winning your constituency, then you can stay there as long as the people will keep having you. Leadership is different. But it strikes me that there's a really palpable difference between the leader who knows this is not forever and governs themselves that way versus the person who continues to hope that the next day, the next mandate is coming. And it always struck me about him that he had a finite amount of time in mind. Like he wasn't going to try to string this out for the rest of his life. And that may be one reason why when he announced his departure, it was such a surprise for a lot of people, because we don't see a lot of voluntary walking off in politics these days.
Yeah. Usually politicians have to be beaten down, kicked in the head, and humiliated.
Oh, yeah.
And don't forget too, Lori, there's a tremendous amount of pressure from the caucus and the other ministers. I mean, these people get elected with the leader, and it's in their interest to have the proven winners lead the pack. And I think, for instance, that's what's going on in the Liberal Party of Canada right now, where there's a lot of talk about getting rid of Trudeau. And I think for the good of the party, maybe they should. But it's awful hard to turn your back on the guy that brought you to, successive majority governments. And, I think McNeil and his people and his pollsters, and I interviewed David Hurley at length on this, they felt he could have won a third. It might have been a near run thing, but it was still possible, they thought.
Okay, that is a great segue. So 2020, COVID. This, I think, Nova Scotia will go down in history as one of the places in the world who managed COVID the best, and Atlantic Canada more broadly. But Nova Scotia is on the map as obviously we're a small province. There's all kinds of reasons why measures taken in Nova Scotia would not have flown in Ontario, would not have flown in British Columbia. Okay, fine. But still, they were political decisions that he took at the time that matched public health advice. He went about this in a certain way, and it brought out a different side of him, I think, right? So the person who we saw for all that time, I'm trying to be very careful in how I say this, even though COVID was awful, like absolutely awful, it was a very different political climate for him, and he showed up very differently. Mm-hmm. There is no doubt in my mind he would have won a third. I think he absolutely would have. He obviously didn't want to. He like, and I can't imagine him not having done it. But maybe without COVID, he wouldn't have. I'm not sure. But it just seemed to be a whole new, like all of a sudden, his style of communication, as unorthodox as it is, was quite appropriate for dealing with a public health crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And then he seemed to be more comfortable in his own skin. And he seemed to be like able to find this, for very unfortunate reasons, was able to find this empathy, that he was able to connect with people differently. And then the awful mass shooting, where he was clearly personally devastated by this and showed that. And it was a really, it was almost not about politics at all at that point. He was stepping out of that role, to me. And I'm not really trying to be really super Stephen McNeil positive or anything. It just seemed to me he stepped out of a political fray role and entered into a different kind of leadership mode at that point.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, just where he was channeling different energy. He was, I think, doing things that he did not ever envision doing in his life. And that was, for the province, I think, when you look across, you look around the Council of Federation and you look at the other premiers, there were times that Stephen McNeil had the worst approval ratings in the country. And that wasn't that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not that long ago at all. But then when all that happened, it was a complete turnaround for him. Yeah.
Well, on so many levels, people don't think about it, but he was experiencing the COVID crisis almost exactly the same as you and I and everybody listening to this today. We were stuck at home. We were communicating virtually. We weren't seeing our colleagues, friends, and family. He lived in his apartment. There was a group of around 7 or 8 people who worked in the premier's office. Everybody else was sent home to work. There was him, Lori Graham, some policy people, some comms people, and they set up these daily sessions with Dr. Strang. And it's weird because Nova Scotia has this strange kind of cultural sort of tribalism that when we get onto something that we like, we're like, wow, we really like this. And people got into this Strang McNeil daily, even though it was the most somber possible material that you were talking about. I mean, remember at the time of the crisis at Northwood, I mean, that was a nightmare. And McNeil felt this very deeply. All the people around him that I spoke to told me how he took it to heart. And it was not just a political or public policy issue. It was families that were getting torn apart. And no, there was no vaccine, remember? We didn't know where it was going to end up. And the other side of that is that these daily briefings, one of my daughters said to me, we were watching them every day. It became this sort of daily show. Like instead of watching a soap opera, you were watching Stephen McNeil and Robert Strang. And they had a very good comms approach. They said they wanted to be specific. They wanted to be clear. They wanted unmistakable and unambiguous messaging because, that's what people needed to hear. Because we didn't know what pandemics really were either. And everybody was in new territory, uncharted territory. And the sort of authoritarian streak in McNeil actually worked to his benefit, I think, then, because these were stern measures that had to be undertaken, and they did. So, but yes, that year, 2020, before the vaccines and before any light on the horizon was visible, McNeil was rebuilding his, not because of a determined political strategy, but he was rebuilding the trust that had been undermined with the public to the point where it was sort of Uncle Stephen, your grumpy old uncle from down the valley, who is telling you what you need to hear. So yeah, it's rare, and just the constant exposure as well, I think, was also almost unique in my experience in politics, almost kind of like Trump or somebody who's on every day, but saying crazy, insane things. In this case, it was the voice of reason that you could turn to every day.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think even across the country, right, when people had their own premiers and their own chief medical officers to listen to, and lots of people, these people became household names in ways that they typically aren't. But you don't hear necessarily a lot of people talking about Nova Scotia politics across the country. And people can't even, most people can't name the premier of Nova Scotia across the country. But Premier McNeil really caught on as like one of the more favored premiers to listen to during that time. And so it speaks to how his, again, as you say, like his communication style seemed to lend itself to that particular set of circumstances.
Very
so
well.
Then you get the shock announcement that he's going to leave. And so, I mean, at the time, it was strange in the sense that I don't think people necessarily, maybe people around him saw it coming. You have had more conversations with him than I have, but can you talk to us about the shock waves that went through his community when he decided he was going to walk away?
Okay. The weekend, the days leading up to that time in early March 2020, I'm going from memory, when it really became clear that this unstoppable virus had escaped somehow from China and was making its way across the world. Stephen McNeil was actually going to Ottawa for a premier's meeting. Lori Graham, his chief of staff, was heading to Florida. She was going to go to Ottawa for the meetings and then get on a plane, go to Florida with her husband for a week off, to, week's holiday. And McNeil had also had holiday plans, but their first priority when they came back after this week off was to write McNeil's farewell speech. So he knew, and Lori knew. Nobody else knew. His cabinet had no idea. The cabinet ministers that I spoke to in the book, they were all completely flabbergasted when the news came out. They really thought he was going to be around to lead them into another election campaign. And they had staked their future on it too, as we mentioned earlier. So, but that was the plan. He was going to go to Ottawa, do the meeting. They were going to take a week off, and then he was going to write his goodbye speech and move on. And but when they saw this news, they first said, okay, the Ottawa meeting is out. They canceled their flights. Lori canceled her vacation plans, and they just assembled a group in the premier's office, the beginnings of the working group that would emerge through the pandemic. Miller and a few others were involved as well. And they resolved to take the public experts' advice and do the best they could with it. Strang and McNeil had only, I think, met once and never really were formally introduced. I mean, Strang was just another functionary within the structure. And so they, at first, McNeil said, okay, well, we'll have to have Strang over here and we'll have a talk. And apparently, according to McNeil and others that I spoke to, the public service was aghast. No, you shouldn't be doing that. The chief medical officer of health is an independent official. You're not supposed to be applying political pressure, et cetera, et cetera. But McNeil said, are you nuts? This is a crisis, and we're going to call all hands on deck to do what needs to be done. So that is exactly what happened. They had a meeting. The two men hit it off really well. But it was over time that their relationship, the one that we saw on television every day, emerged. But they had each other's back. They didn't contradict each other because they realized that would have been fatal to public confidence. People needed to hear clear, unambiguous messages in order to work together for the common good at that time of crisis.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when he made that announcement, this was because, I guess, because COVID had gotten to a point where he felt it was, so were we out of the woods to a certain extent, and he felt he could walk away because, like, when he, because from March, if he had been planning to kind of do his trip to Ottawa and everything, and then come back and kind of walk away, obviously that got stopped. So then, if my memory is right, it was August 2020 when he made the announcement that he was leaving, which then set up for Ian Rankin and set up for the election that was to happen in 2021. And so he walked away because he felt COVID locked, the numbers were improving, things were under control. He could step away at that point.
There was light at the end of the tunnel. Vaccines were emerging, or at least it looked like they were going to be possible. But this was all his plan. He was sticking to his plan, and his plan was to retire and serve 2 terms. He didn't want to get stuck and be kicked out of office. He wanted to go on his own terms. And, so that is what happened. And they made the announcement. He had a preferred candidate, by the way, who I was told about on a confidential off-the-record thing, but the person he wanted to take over the Liberal Party didn't want the job. It was a very highly experienced politician with a winning track record, but who didn't want to do it. And so McNeil didn't really have a favorite in that. And as I document in the book, he became very disillusioned with Rankin, and in fact didn't even help the party overall in the 21 election, which was quite a shock to all concerned, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a good note for us to kind of draw to a close on, because we are coming to the end of time, and I know people might have something else to get to, but I do want to ask you, what about that? Sometimes we see now, as we alluded to before, right? It's very difficult when people are running with a leader, they're loyal to the leader. Loyalty is a huge thing in politics, probably the most important thing in politics. And so then how do you transition when the leader leaves? Because people are afraid to put their hands up, and you don't want to, you don't want to mess yourself up. You don't want to rip the party in half. You don't want the Chrétien Martin situation all over again. So he decides he's going to step aside. For a while, there's crickets. Nobody wants it. Nobody's putting their hand up. We eventually end up with 3 caucus members, 3 men, 3 white men. There is an obvious silence from McNeil. How much is this kind of part of this phenomenon, that when a leader leaves, is it fair to say that the party is really left in a bit of an existential crisis? And is that a fair description of what happened to the Liberal Party in his departure?
Yeah, I think it's a perfectly fair criticism of Stephen Harper that he didn't do enough to prepare the ground for his successors. And a lot of leaders get that way. They're so obsessed with the daily, management of government and the challenges that come up. And of course, McNeil was in a very busy space himself, given all that was going on in his second term. But he didn't do enough to nurture a leader. And I think he was surprised and disappointed when his preferred person turned him down. And, it kind of did get left to these 3 rather lackluster candidates for the leadership. I don't know who I would have voted for had I been a Liberal. I would have had to hold my nose and vote for somebody. But Rankin was definitely not the man or the person to stand in that job. And in comparison with McNeil, who was a firm leader and had an agenda, he looked very weak and indecisive. And in fact, as it transpired, he couldn't even bring himself to tell the truth to his own people on some very major issues. And this is what brought about his downfall, and maybe 15 years or so in the wilderness for the Liberals. I don't know. But, all leaders, passing off, as we saw with John Hamm wasn't, I don't think, fatally hurt when he left. He had his day. He wasn't in great health. His back was killing him. He had served his time honorably and wanted to turn it over. And I remember standing at the Metro Center the night that Rodney MacDonald got elected by the Conservative Party and just scratching my head and going, this is not going to work. And it didn't. And so it's very tough to do, very hard to turn over the reins to a new leader and to maintain your party in power. And this is, the Liberals found that out to their regret.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that hour flew by.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was so fascinating to listen to. I'm just going to thank you for myself, and then I'll turn things back over to Cynthia. But I just wanted to say how much we all learn from you all the time on every topic you write about. But the book is absolutely extraordinary, and I hope that everybody, if you haven't already, get a chance to grab it, because it is fascinating. It is a fascinating book on not just Stephen McNeil, but what it is like to be a leader, what kinds of challenges leaders face, and all of the political terrain that we've discussed today, plus 100,000 other things. So thank you very much, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Lori. That's very kind.
I echo what Lori said. I can't believe that hour flew by so quickly. We probably could have stayed on a little bit longer, maybe a couple more hours, maybe next time. Thank you, Dan and Lori, for letting us listen in on your great conversation. And Dan, this has been an amazing debrief on your experience in creating such an in-depth book. I have to say, as someone who does contribute to those magical briefing books, I was particularly excited and appreciative to note Stephen McNeil's commitment to absorbing all that information we throw together. And on behalf of our attendees, thank you so much for making the time late in the day to partner with us on this event. I also just want to thank the folks on the board and our membership that kind of make these events happen for us behind the scenes. It takes a team usually to pull it all together, right? And just to let you know, our IPAC programs will take a little bit of a pause over the summer months, but keep an eye out for the odd networking event and what's going to come up in the fall. So grab a membership or subscribe to our email, and you'll be able to be kept up to date. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great evening and stay cool.
Thanks again, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity.